The RCMP called it a race against time. A tip from the FBI first thing yesterday morning. One of those videos from ISIS sympathizers we've seen so many times. But this time, the target was Canada and the planned attack imminent.
There was no definitive location. In fact, when it first came to us, it was Canada-wide.
Within hours, police believe they had their suspect, Aaron Driver, a man well known to police, so well known that today RCMP faced tough questions about why he was able to get as close as he did to unleashing terror. Aaron Driver was actually in a cab carrying explosives. The CBC's Katie Simpson begins our coverage tonight from Ottawa. Katie.
Police keep repeating this situation could have been so much worse, Rosie, and they're thanking American security officials for a tip that stopped what appeared to be an impending attack here at home.
Oh, Canada, you received many warnings.
This is the evidence police say triggered a dramatic race against time.
You still have Muslim blood on your hands, and for this, we are thirsty for your blood.
For about 2 minutes, the man in the balaclava makes vague but violent threats against Canadians before pledging allegiance to the leader of ISIS.
There's a fire burning in the chests of every Muslim, and this fire can be cooled only by the spilling of your blood.
When the FBI learned about this video yesterday morning, investigators immediately flagged it to the RCMP. An urgent investigation was launched, even though there was very little specific information to go on.
The attack was supposed to be taking place within the following 72 hours and was likely to target an urban center either during morning or afternoon rush hour.
Several major public transit agencies were warned about a generic, credible threat. Security was also increased in some Canadian airports, including Toronto's Pearson International. As precautions were put in place, police narrowed in on a suspect, and within hours, they identified the masked man as Aaron Driver, a homegrown radical who first caught the attention of Canada's spy agency in 2014. He publicly supported ISIS and was supposed to be living by the terms of a peace bond, a legal promise to be on good behavior. But yesterday, police quietly surrounded the home he shared with his sister in Strathroy, Ontario. And when a taxi unexpectedly arrived, police confronted the suspect as he hopped in the back of a cab.
The sure fact was if he had gotten out of that residence before we got there, the scenario would have ended a lot differently. I'm positive of that.
Driver detonated an explosive device, injuring himself and the cabbie. Officers fired shots, and soon after, Driver was dead. This incident is prompting new questions about how the government deals with homegrown radicals and whether peace bonds, like the one given to Driver, work.
We will learn any and all lessons that need to be learned from this process, including whether or not there need to be adjustments in the criminal code.
Even though Driver was considered a threat, he was not under constant police surveillance, and he was no longer required to wear a tracking bracelet under the terms of his peace bond. But that isn't the only concern some security experts have with this legal strategy.
We've got a dilemma in Canada right now that we can impose a peace bond on someone, but then nothing happens after that. I think we could have probably forced him into some kind of program where at least the odds of changing his views would have increased.
Ottawa is promising to open a new counter-radicalization center, but specific details haven't yet been released. And tonight, Rosie, ISIS is claiming responsibility for this incident, saying it was a planned attack on police.
Thanks for that, Katie. That's the CBC's Katie Simpson. Katie mentioned a couple of times there peace bonds. Police say they're an effective way to contain a threat when there are insufficient grounds to lay charges. Aaron Driver was under a peace bond just as he planned and almost carried out his attack, a fact that left many today wondering how effective they really are. Well, peace bonds are basically a protection order issued by a court. They include conditions of release, things like keeping the peace, obeying the law, not owning weapons, and maybe even, as Driver did, wearing a tracking bracelet.
What the peace bonds do not provide for at this stage is that interconnection with some kind of an intervener who can make a difference in that person's behavior.
If the conditions of a peace order are broken, the individual can face criminal charges. Well, we know a lot about the last few hours of Aaron Driver's life. What pushed him to become the kind of person who would launch an attack against his fellow Canadians? The CBC's Caroline Bargout spoke to several people today who have that insight.
Born to Christian parents in 1991 on a farm in Saskatchewan, life started out almost ordinary for Aaron Driver. Then his mother died of cancer when he was 7.
I knew he was mad at the world because of his mother dying, but I didn't realize he was turning his hatred outward to the world.
Wayne Driver later remarried and joined the Canadian military, so the family moved around a lot. At 14, Aaron was kicked out for smoking pot and moved into a halfway house. By 17, he and his girlfriend were expecting a baby, but their son died in childbirth. In an exclusive interview with CBC News last year, he said that propelled him to find a new religion.
I just decided that it couldn't possibly be the Word of God. So I started watching debates to find some answers. And the Muslims were always destroying them in these debates.
He moved to Winnipeg in 2012 to live with his father and went back to high school to get his diploma. He also took up Arabic. Those who knew him say he was polite, hardworking and respectful. But on social media, Driver, who was now in his 20s, showed a different side, tweeting support for ISIS. That landed him on a CSIS watch list and later in jail for fears he might commit a terror attack, a claim he challenged.
No, I don't think I'm a threat, and I don't think there's a reason for, Canadians to think that I'm a threat.
In 2015, police raided his home. Then a Manitoba court issued him a peace bond that restricted his online movements and forced him to wear an ankle bracelet. Driver lived in the basement of this home. His former landlady says he never gave her any problems. He had a full-time job and went to school. He even had a girlfriend. But she says things changed after his arrest. He lost his job and couldn't get EI or welfare. A judge allowed Driver to move to Strathroy, Ontario to live with his sister. Not long after, he visited a nearby mosque.
At that time, we made a decision to not turn a blind eye to him, but rather to engage him, try and get him on a different path than he was on.
It didn't work.
Still some shock, some disbelief, but then when you see your son there on television, there's no denying what was going on.
Wayne Driver didn't believe his son had been fully radicalized. Now he can't deny it. Caroline Bargout, CBC News, Winnipeg.
There's still a heavy police presence in Strathroy, Ontario tonight. People who witnessed what went down there yesterday said they couldn't believe it was happening on their quiet street. Our Ellen Morrow spent the day speaking with many of them who live there. Ellen.
Rosie, the shock of what happened here behind me yesterday has not worn off for people in Strathroy. The morning after, and this is a town still very much on edge.
I just heard yelling and I looked out my window and there was people with snipers.
That's what Alicia Campbell Pereira woke up to Wednesday afternoon after sleeping late following a midnight shift. Today, it still doesn't feel real.
I haven't slept yet, so I'm still in shock. I don't know. Yeah, I just have I can't explain my feelings right now.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Aaron Driver lived in Strathroy with his sister and her family. Maria Mello would sometimes see him around the neighborhood.
She said, "Hi, how you doing?" But we never have big conversation, but we see him a normal person.
So to his neighbors at least, Driver largely lived under the radar until yesterday when he died in a dramatic RCMP takedown. The police taking action as he tried to leave in a cab, his destination believed to be a London shopping mall. He detonated an explosive device inside the taxi. The driver was only slightly injured. Brandon Carrero's parents own the taxi company that Driver called.
Sent the driver, and then we didn't hear from the driver, and then next thing you know, we got a phone call saying this happened. You need to get down here.
I imagine it. Strathroy's mayor said she had been informed a known extremist was living in the town, but she was powerless to do anything about it.
This is something that really shocks everyone, and it just sits in the bottom of your stomach and in your heart that how does this happen in a small community?
It's a question many here are struggling with.
I don't even want her to play in the front yard anymore, you know? So, but I do feel like this is isolated, but it's concerning.
So a lingering sense of unease here, but one thing we've learned in Strathroy today is that the town's motto is "We advance," and certainly advancing past the memory of yesterday is the collective desire of the town today. Rosie?
Thanks for that, Ellen. Coming up, we sit down with the man who tried to understand how Aaron Driver was radicalized.
He never really struck me as someone who would actually follow through.
Returning to our top story, as we saw earlier, several people tried to walk Aaron Driver back from his radicalized views of Islam. At least one tried to understand them and challenge Driver to defend them. Amarnath Amarsingham is an expert in foreign fighters and jihadis from the University of Waterloo. I spoke to him about Aaron Driver earlier today. First of all, tell me how you met Aaron Driver.
We met because the court had hired us to be a part of his, or to assess whether he's an actual threat to the Canadian public back when he was defending his peace bond and so on. And so that's when we were called in to kind of talk to him for an extended period of time to get a sense of his life, his motivations, you know, the kind of contours around which his support for the Islamic State was articulated and how he thought about those kinds of issues.
So what did you think about the chance of him doing something like this?
I mean, he was certainly radicalized, and so he wasn't shy about his support for the Islamic State. But what was interesting about him was he also had very kind of nuanced understandings of the legitimate use of violence and when violence was allowed under Islamic law, and whether attacking civilians was allowed and so on. And so he kind of struck us as one of these guys who definitely had radical ideas, but wasn't necessarily going to act on those ideas in terms of moving to radicalization to violence, as we know. And so while he expressed all kinds of stuff, and he certainly wasn't quiet about it or shy about it, he could tell you in very great detail why he supports ISIS. We even asked him very bluntly, do you consider yourself a member of ISIS in Canada? And he said yes. But the question of, is he one of these guys who could launch an attack in Toronto, launch an attack in some Canadian city? At that time, he didn't strike us as someone susceptible in a way.
So what do you think happened? When you're dealing with someone like this, does something trigger it? Does something push them in some direction?
I mean, based on the available evidence, and particularly, I think, the very important video that was released by the RCMP, where he quite openly gives bayah to the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in similar language as a lot of the previous attackers that we've seen this year in European cities and so on, kind of signals to me that over the last few months, he was particularly kind of drawn into the rhetoric of ISIS spokesperson Adnani, who called for increased attacks during the month of Ramadan, followed by the actual increased attacks during the month of Ramadan in a variety of different cities from Bangladesh onwards. I think kind of inspired him to maybe do the same. And he realized that all these attacks were happening in Europe, and Canada was getting a free ride, so to speak, and that Canada, with its involvement in the coalition, should still pay a price.
But you didn't see any of that developing through your communications with him?
No. The last time I talked to him was April of this year, and it was basically around the issue, ironically, of prevention and CVE. So I had emailed him shortly after the Canadian Council of Muslims announced their Countering Violent Extremism program, and I kind of messaged him and said, like, have any of these guys gotten in touch with you? Has the government gotten in touch with you? Have you been approached as a kind of candidate, ideal candidate for prevention? And he said no, and he kind of badmouthed the entire initiative, basically saying, you know, we should be allowed to believe what we want, and most of these imams are sellouts and hypocrites who drive, you know, fancy cars to their mosques and aren't really in touch with youth and what we believe, and so on. So that conversation ended with this, you know, I'm doing great in London. I have a job, I have a good group of friends here, you know, I'm finally not idle anymore, I'm actually doing something. And this was just 3 months ago. So,
But fair to say you were surprised.
I was utterly shocked, yeah.
Why? Just because you never thought he would go that far, or?
He never struck me as, you know, as someone who spent several hours with him, talked to him, text messaged with him. You know, he was always very defensive of his position of the Islamic State, but was never advocating violence. He definitely praised other people's attacks from the Garland attack onwards, but he never really struck me as someone who would actually follow through. And so when that picture went out with his mask, I was kind of like, that's Aaron. I can pick those eyes out anywhere.
How did he get so to be so noticed online?
One thing to understand about the ISIS kind of media sphere, or the social media sphere, is there's a lot of supporters who get a lot of meaning and purpose from being part of that online community. They don't really fit in because of what they believe and what they think in everyday society. They're not able to, even at their mosque, in their community centers, at schools, at universities, they're not allowed to talk about these things. They're not allowed to express admiration for jihadis and support for the Islamic State. And so for Aaron, just being there, retweeting, praising attacks, all kind of endeared him to the community. And he was articulate and bright, and he was a convert, and all those things are quite valuable for the online community. But he was quite plugged into the network of people, that to the point where he popped up on our radar quite quickly. But that in itself is not worrisome in a sense, because you have a lot of supporters, a lot of people who are involved in this community who actually don't do anything except tweet and retweet. And so when do you know that that kind of support, that level of support, is tipping over into something you should be concerned about? It's very difficult.
So what's the lesson for authorities, for people like you who are trying to understand these guys? For the rest of us, what's the lesson?
I think the lesson is to understand the contours of what they believe in, to the extent that when events happen in Syria or Iraq, we can kind of predict how some of these youth are going to respond. And what I mean by that is, you had the call come out for attacks, you had attacks happen, and the guy that you think it's going to affect might just be at home playing Nintendo and doesn't care. And so to get a sense of how do international events impact the social and emotional reactions of some of these youth actually means that you have to take their ideology seriously. And if you just dismiss it as, oh, it's a mental health issue, or it's a socioeconomic issue, or it's actually, you know, something else, you're going to miss a lot of that. You're going to miss a lot of that reaction. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Appreciate you making the time.
Aaron Driver was just one person the RCMP was aware of, but what about all the others? Are the current resources enough to deal with current threats? Michael Zakulin is a terrorism expert at the University of Calgary. Nice to see you, Michael.
Nice to see you.
So let's start there. Do you think right now that police have the resources, the tools that they need to try and prevent things like this from happening?
Well, I mean, judging on what happened today, you could raise some serious questions about that. You remember that sort of peace bonds were this middle ground, individuals who raise enough of a concern that they need special monitoring versus the fact that they had not yet breached any type of criminal, code. So the bottom line is this was felt to sort of be adequate to impose certain restrictions on them. And in this case, it seems that perhaps a discussion needs to be had about what went wrong here.
What do you make of the fact that they removed that monitoring bracelet from him back in February? Was that ultimately a mistake now in your view, or why do you think the courts made that decision and decided to let him move forward?
Well, again, that's a great question, and this will be information that I'm sure will either come out or that will be sort of, asked for moving forward. The bottom line is it depends. I mean, again, if you're removing the ankle bracelet, it depends on the movements of the individual. Was he out and about? Was he moving around? In the context of being a lone actor, if he's not actively going out and meeting people or things of that nature, then it's unclear, what a GPS monitoring would have done. The police already have suggested that they were monitoring him, but it wasn't sort of continuous 24/7 monitoring.
So, I mean, I guess that begs the question then, how do you track these people? How do you know when something like this is going to happen? When do you know when the tipping point is?
Yeah, and this is the reality and the challenge. Look, this is an art. It's not a science. There's no indicators or profiling in the sense of an individual who has, radical ideas. That's one thing. Individuals who then make the leap or escalate to pursuing violence based on those ideas is something entirely different. And again, we are woefully inadequate in our ability to predict who that might be. So having radical ideas, watching people, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be violent. And if you look around, there's sort of lately we've seen a lot of incidents of individuals who were on the radar who then managed to sort of slip through the cracks.
The fact that this came from the FBI, rather, that the RCMP was tipped off by the FBI, should that worry Canadians in any way, or to you is that just sort of normal intelligence sharing?
Well, look, I recognize on the surface it looks troubling, but the reality is that you can actually see this as sort of a positive in the sense that the cooperation and information sharing by Canada and the United States, came through in this case. And we know that in the context of Europe, for example, the information sharing and coordinating is much poorer, and there have been resulted in some significant challenges. So no, I take this as a positive, but at the same time, it should be a lesson that the RCMP needs to sort of examine what they're doing.
Okay, Michael Zakulis, we'll leave it there. Thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.